The auditorium exploded into a new kind of chaos before anyone could translate it into language. Glass spun like silver rain from the podium, cameras jerked off their tracks, and the carefully scripted smiles on Vought's public relations team folded into the frantic geometry of containment. Security moved with practiced precision. Microphones kept spilling live audio into a world that had tuned in for choreography and got something else instead. And somewhere behind the rows, a bodyguard's shout cut off when a man simply walked down the center aisle with his hands in his pockets. He looked patient, amused, and absolutely not impressed by the performance. Satoru Gojo. And that small, unhurried step rewired the room's electricity. Homelander posed where cameras loved him, tried to reclaim the frame with a smile that was meat and threat at once, and the handlers pushed their talking points like shields. They did not notice their shields refracting around a rule they could not name. By the time anchors found the phrase unexpected disturbance, every legal strategy, every media spin, and every quiet plan for escalation had already shifted. This was the first audible fracture, and it was only the beginning of something far worse forming in the wings. You are watching this because the next hour will show how a single crossing of a stage breaks more than a press release. Listen closely and don't pretend this is entertainment. If you want the fallout in full, subscribe now. This leak will spread, and when it does, your sense of safety will have to choose a side. I walked into a room that had been designed to swallow surprises and spit out polished answers, and the first thing I noticed was how thin the air smelled, like antiseptic and confidence, a cheap perfume Vought sold in bulk to anyone who still believed rhetoric could bend reality. Cameras were arranged like teeth, reporters sat like trained animals waiting for the whistle, and on the dais Homelander stood where cameras loved him most. Perfectly lit, cape arranged, smile tuned to national consumption, while a woman in a designer suit rehearsed the word partnership in a voice that had been cleared for maximum corporate trust. I felt the choreography before it reached my ears, the way handlers moved in little predictable arcs, and I found that entertaining in the same way one watches a magician counting his sleeves. I did not come for performance. I came to see what happens when someone built for propaganda meets someone who refuses to be packaged. They announced me like a new product and smiled as if smiling could seal a contract, and the PR lead, too calm to be sincere, offered the staged handshake everyone had already consented to on paper. I kept my hands in my pockets because hands make commitments and I don't like signing other people's forms. And when the assistant leaned forward with a lapel mic, the room expected the little ritual. Microphones clip, cameras close, a nation listens. The mic didn't touch my jacket. It hung a breath away, the clip hovering where fabric should have been, and a tiny noise of confusion rippled through the front row before the audio tech cursed and tried to push it again. No one said the word infinity because they didn't need to. What they saw was a physical refusal of contact, a polite, immovable space that refused to be recorded like a stage prop refusing its script. Homelander's smile was the first thing to flicker, a micro-fault you only notice if you are watching someone try very hard to be what they think the cameras want. He took a step forward because dominance likes to be measured in proximity, and the handlers adjusted in a way that said they wanted him to own the moment without actually touching it. They always prefer optics over unpredictability. I watched him with the sort of detached curiosity I reserve for predictable threats. He was calibrated for public consumption, power wrapped in a smile and a story, and that makes men brittle in a room full of mirrors. He tried to reclaim the frame with a laugh that was slightly too loud and a compliment that was too sharp, and the applause that had been cued by Vought's team felt suddenly like the wrong backing track for a scene that had already shifted. Reporters began with the expected lines, the soft-led questions that sound like cooperation until you realize they are instructions, and a woman with a daytime anchor voice asked if I had considered working with Vought to help ensure responsible use of power. I smiled because smiling is a language everyone understands, and I said something that worked like a stone dropped in a pond. I asked whether they wanted help or a leash, and my voice was light enough that it sounded like a joke until the question sat heavy in the air. Cameras found that tiny blank where the mic had been trying to touch me and lingered, because the image of a microphone refusing to complete its duty translates into a dozen different narratives in a single frame. The handlers shuffled, because PR scripts have lines, and when you step off them, people try to find the exit they were promised. A guard made the mistake of thinking physicality could do what narrative couldn't, and he stepped forward with that particular brand of authority people buy with training and a badge. He put a hand out the way people do when they mean to correct someone who is out of place, and his fingers closed on nothing. A guard's palm dove through the air as if it had met cold glass, and the motion ended with him stumbling like a man who'd expected friction and been denied it. Silence isn't built into stadiums and conference halls, so when it happened there were 3 audible reactions: a sharp inhale from the front rows, a click of a camera lens, and the faint curse of a handler who realized a visual had escaped the script. Homelander's jaw tightened in that micro-expression only cameras can catch, the one that says the performance is failing and the actor must change the scene. They tried to bring the cameras back to order by sending a producer's whisper to every channel, an instruction that spread through earpieces like a sanitizing command. But feeds are stubborn things when the world has decided to watch. I could feel the room's attention pivot toward me and inward at the same time, small waves of panic underneath the practiced faces. And I let it happen because restraint is more powerful than spectacle when you want to watch someone unravel themselves. Homelander stepped closer again, closer in a way that tries to occupy space as an argument. I am the star, I will be acknowledged. I tilted my head in the kind of amused assessment I give to a bully with an audience, and because I was not moving with force, the cameras had nothing to dramatize except their own confusion. Vought's CEO, an efficient, polite man who spends his life dressing words in suits, moved into damage control with the clinical rhythm of someone used to spinning storms into press releases, and he started nomming benefits like a vending machine listing options. He talked about integration, safety, oversight, and data, numbers instead of ethics, which is always easier to market, and he did it with a cadence designed to make people sleep through the moral cost. I listened and watched the way he flinched when the cameras cut to Homelander's face, because even in charge there are things executives fear: losing the narrative, losing money, and above all losing control. I interrupted him with a triviality, the verbal equivalent of a light tap on a shoulder, and watched the man swallow a line he'd clearly rehearsed for applause. Homelander's smile had thinned into irritation now, a visible change you can see even when a man tries to hide it for television, and he spoke a line meant to remind people which side of the coin they were on. He said something about responsibility being a two-way street, and about how celebrities with power must answer to the public. And the phrase was both a warning and a promise because that's how he operates. Polite threat wrapped in civic duty. I answered with a small story about not being something you can own, said it lightly so it sounded like a quip, and the laughter that followed felt unearned because the room was no longer laughing with me. It was laughing at the fissure the cameras had exposed. The subtle humiliation wasn't dramatic. It was 1,000 micro-adjustments, handlers changing posture, an anchor's smile taut, a producer's hand hovering over a mute button. Someone on the floor, a Vought security director, whose name I noticed only because names are useful, whispered into an earbud and called a protocol name that meant escalation without the word, something sterile and efficient that translates into action far beyond the room. That voice made a motion with his hand that suggested containment teams, logistical responses, and a legal machine waking up to clear its throat. For a company that monetizes certainty, a single strange visual, an object refusing to touch a man in the middle of a live feed, was an existential problem. It invites regulators, alarms investors, and destabilizes the product. When the director tapped his watch and made a call, he set in motion a chain that would not be contained by statements and NDAs. By the time feeds began to split and networks ran the same clip with different music, the story had spread beyond Vought's control. Social media picked up the mic refusal, pundits speculated, and governments that prefer surprises to be scheduled sent quiet inquiries through channels I've learned to read like traffic. Homelander's irritation reached for a new tactic, intimidation without blood, because breaking a stage doesn't require violence if you can make the spectacle your weapon, but he misjudged the fact that I don't compete for stages. I smiled, and that smile was a kind of refusal as deliberate as the mic's hovering. It said I was not impressed and I was not for sale, and the cameras ate that ambiguity until commentators tried to frame it for clicks. Someone upstairs at Vought, a voice I will meet later, hit a protocol that had a name but no moral conscience, and the word moved like a shadow through the company's layers. Hard lock. It was a decision that would send people I had never met into action, policy people who would decide to treat me as a variable that needed erasing or owning. For a public relations problem, the room had just converted into a geopolitical hazard, because nothing fractures trust like an unexplainable anomaly on live television, and trust is Vought's primary product. I left the dais without ceremony because I don't make entrances for applause, and as I walked out the cameras held my image and the word, hard lock, began its slow, inevitable migration through secure lines and capitals. I walked back into the teeth of it because leaving would have let them tell a story without me in it, and the next morning the air had a different taste, sour with the scent of a crisis being dressed up as a problem to be solved. Newsrooms looped the clip of the mic refusing to touch me until the image hardened into a meme and a moral question, and Vought filed its first legal brief before lunch, the language clinical and designed to sound inevitable. Their public posture shifted from charm to containment so fast it looked rehearsed, which meant it had been rehearsed. The company had a vocabulary for crisis, and every word in it was already animated. I watched all of it from a distance that kept me safe and kept me bored enough to play with their patience as if it were a toy. Homelander moved like a current through the center of the narrative, and he did what he does best. He turned presence into policy. Homelander smiled on camera and then smiled harder in private, as if smiles could be stacked into armor. The first time he tried to dominate the frame, it was a social tactic, leaning toward a reporter, placing himself where producers hoped light would turn him into a symbol, and the crowd obliged because culture eats spectacle for breakfast. He stepped forward in a way that meant to reassert authorship over the moment, and when a hand from his security team moved to make sure no one stepped between him and his light, the world watched choreography try to become violence. Vought didn't wait for moral outrage to find its shape. The company pivoted instantly from PR to policy. Vought International released a statement that read like a contract: threats of litigation, offers of safe collaboration, and a quiet hint that any interference would be treated as a criminal act. Stan Edgar moved behind that language like a surgeon behind a blade, precise and practiced, and when he spoke in the internal briefing the room listened because he had taught them how to believe numbers instead of ethics. Stan Edgar ordered hard lock to be escalated, which meant a legal freeze, a PR clampdown, and a security posture moving into a new, less public dimension. The company began to frame the conversation. Either you accept Vought's stewardship, or you are dangerous. That framing was the first real escalation because it forced decisions outside the room. Regulators read the statement and sent cold, careful inquiries. Investors scanned balance sheets for panic triggers, and law enforcement began to ask questions that would not stay polite for long. Vought's lawyers started sewing together a narrative that made me a variable in a market, and markets hate unpredictability more than they hate murder. The legal action was deliberate because legal systems are long, and long things can strangle movements quietly. It was a move designed not to touch me directly, but to change the environment I existed in. That kind of pressure is an escalation you can feel like a tightening wire before you see the cut. Homelander did not let the corporate machinery do all of his work. He wanted the cameras to remember whose face reads as power. He walked the stage in a way that made it clear his plan had two parts: dominate the public conversation and force me into a reaction that could be filmed. When a reporter asked him on live television whether Vought would take necessary measures against any unregistered sorcerer, I heard the word chosen for theatrical effect. Homelander's eyes rested on me with a weight that made the hair on the back of a man's neck rise. He smiled for the cameras while the muscles under that smile tightened. The public watched a hero asking permission to punish a problem he framed as a threat. The message was subtle but effective. He would be the arbiter. I let him be the arbiter for a moment because giving him the stage let him reveal himself to the audience, and that's a kindness I can afford. His intimidation is a performance, and the truer threat lives in the moments actors forget to control. He wanted to provoke me, to make me angry, to give his handlers a clip that justified escalation. I played with the idea like a cat with a string. I answered him calmly on camera. Then off camera, I walked across the newsroom floor and greeted a producer as if I were the one asking to be interviewed. The effect was immediate. The cameras flicked between our faces trying to find a narrative and landed on a new truth, that his optics could be challenged without violence. When the challenge failed to resolve into compliance, Homelander chose spectacle over subterfuge and demonstrated why his presence carries weight. He rose into the air once, hovered with impossible stillness, and the feed focused on him like religion. The moment stretched and then snapped into action. He unleashed a laser of pure kinetic intent in a direction that missed me by a hair, and the blast hit a support beam in the conference space, sending a thud through the floor and a spray of debris that tore the curated calm into shards. The building did not collapse, but the press room's roof lost part of itself, and with that small architectural failure, Vaught's control evaporated into chaos. Cameras kept rolling, because the world prefers footage to crisis, and the live shot showed a man who had tried to demonstrate dominance and instead revealed panic. The optic blast was a logical failure and a human one. He could not touch me, and so he chose to touch the room instead. That choice was a major confrontation because it translated a social argument into real-world damage with victims who had nothing to do with our dispute. People screamed, cameras focused on the living, and somewhere in the middle of the noise, an anchor's voice cracked in a way that would later make good copy. Homelander's composure fractured under the weight of unintended consequence, and the cameras caught it, his jaw working like a lever, his smile slipping into an expression the public had not paid to see. For the first time, his threat produced casualties, and casualties make narratives much harder to control. Vought spun immediately, but the spin could not undo the physics of shattered glass or the humanity of a mother screaming for her child. Legal teams drafted liability statements while paramedics moved through the wreckage. The company's internal channels sent a memo to its investors about operational anomalies, and to the government about possible public safety issues, a phrasing designed to escalate concern without admitting culpability. The word hard lock moved into new hands, regulatory and governmental, and a line item for emergency response was opened at the national level. The room that had been a stage became an incident site, and once an incident becomes an incident, it draws heat from places that prefer to remain unseen. I watched all of this with a measured amusement that was both indulgent and strategic, because being calm in a crisis distorts how others act around you. Homelander tried to force me into a reaction and failed. The company tried to turn me into a problem, and failed to keep its own star from creating victims. The irreversible piece of this was not that a beam had struck a room, but that a public now had footage of a man who had tried to demonstrate power and made people bleed in the process. That footage would travel past PR teams, past lawyers, into courts of public opinion that are not easily pacified with talk of partnerships. Once witnesses exist and victims are named, narratives harden and opportunities close. In the minutes that followed the blast, government frequencies lit up with quiet urgency, and a new term arrived in my inbox, containment directive, which read like a legal order born of fear. It was not a military deployment yet, but it was a firm crossing of lines. Surveillance would increase, certain airspaces would be restricted, and agencies would coordinate in ways that would make Vaught's legal cages look like child's play. My presence had become a node in a network that both private power and public authority were now trying to control, and the collision had shifted from theater to policy. The feed that showed Homelander hovering over a ruined ceiling would be the image regulators, investors, and activists used to justify actions that would outlast the news cycle. I read the morning the way other people read headlines, and what met me was a line of decisions being signed like a series of trapdoors. Vought International had moved beyond press statements into legal choreography, injunctions, asset freezes, and a tidy internal memo that renamed the incident from Mike Anomaly to Operational Risk. The company's language was surgical because language is a tool executives use to rewrite consequences into spreadsheets, and the phrase, hard lock, had already been elevated in tone from corporate protocol to quasi-legislative order. That elevation matters because once a private procedure gains the shape of a public policy, it can be disguised as safety while doing something much more invasive. I watched Stan Edgar move through the background like a conductor who never plays an instrument, and his first instinct was containment through ownership. He pitched the idea that Vought could buy stability, an offer to governments framed as partnership, but designed to privatize the power to decide who counts as a threat. He used words like stewardship and integration with the same calm you see in surgeons who know how to close a wound so no one notices the knife. When a CEO offers to be both the doctor and the judge, you do not ask him what the verdict will be. You ask how much he will charge per year. The government response came in layers like an onion you keep peeling until your eyes water. Regulators called for classified briefings, while legislative staffers drafted language for emergency measures, and an internal memorandum labeled my presence, a variable requiring interagency coordination. Airports tightened screening, certain airspaces flicked to restricted status, and intelligence teams opened channels with Vaught's legal counsel, public-private alignment at speed. This was bureaucracy becoming a weapon, not a missile but a rule that could be enforced with paperwork, surveillance, and the legend of legality. Military planners did not move to rockets and war rooms just yet. They moved to observation and denial, the sort of response you'd give to an unknown hazard you wanted mapped before you chose a remedy. Drones and unmarked surveillance, assets adjusted orbits, and a handful of Black Ops pockets began building contingency plans that would look like detention and study on paper and like abduction in practice. No one wanted a headline that said, "Nation kidnaps foreign sorcerer." They preferred euphemism. But euphemism is often the first step toward moral compromise. The instinct was to make me legible on every intel feed, to turn me from an anomaly into a file. Vought continued trying to sell the narrative that it was the stabilizing force, and the PR machine pumped stories about safety protocols and voluntary integration. They released controlled footage, expert panels, and op-eds that framed me as an unknown that required oversight, and the image of my relaxed smile became a counterpoint in think pieces arguing for registration and control. Social feeds split into factions. Conspiracy threads that painted me as an alien weapon, worried families demanding protection, and a small, bright current of voices asking why a corporation should decide who lives free. That last current was noisy but not yet organized, and the way corporations profit on chaos is by monetizing every answer before an audience finds its own. Homelander didn't react with fury at first. He reacted like a star who finds his light stealing for attention. He leaned into the cameras with the manufactured warmth his handlers loved and told the country he stood for safety, for stability, for the heroic order. But the cameras, being cameras, recorded the micro moment where his smile stiffened into calculation, and anyone who knows to watch faces saw the gears shift. When power is performance, the performance itself becomes the political act, and his act was to make me the containment narrative's villain while claiming the mantle of protector. What turned the story from theater to covert action was not a loud confrontation, but a quiet operation that night. A containment team organized in a warehouse 2 miles from where I was staying. People with names that meant nothing until you realized they meant everything. Contractors, ex-military, private security with government liaison cards. They did what such teams always do first. They sent tech to test the edges. A drone with a capture rig hummed toward my building as a dry run, and the people watching on feeds expected malfunction or a clear result. What they got was the kind of confusion that breaks people's faith in their own tools. The drone's arm extended and stopped, a little shy of contact, and its telemetry showed a collision with nothing at all. Engineers cursed, men stared at screens, and the feed became a field for 3 competing explanations: equipment failure, electromagnetic interference, or something deliberately hidden. That equipment failure was a demonstration, subtle in form but louder than any broadcast. The operators read the same log. An approaching object experienced what looked like an impenetrable plane at specifically the area where it would have made contact with me. No loud explosion, no display of light, just the mechanical refusal of a machine to finish its task, and enough ambiguity to seed panic in a room that prefers certainty. Vought's counsel insisted it was a glitch. Independent analysts speculated about new tech. Conspiracy channels called it proof of otherworldly power. All of them were correct in a way. It was a new kind of refusal that could be explained, controlled, or weaponized, depending on who told the story. When corporations and governments begin to trade in explanations, law tends to follow money, and the compromise is almost always structural. Vought pushed for legal instruments that would let private entities enforce public safety through contracts with governments, an arrangement that would make their security teams an arm of the state without the same transparency. That is the kind of escalation that is quiet and irreversible, because once private security holds state authority, the public's recourse becomes murky. The proposed measures included asset control, emergency detention warrants, and a framework for temporary custody of anomalies, phrases that read like temporary fixes and behaved like permanent silences. Outside those halls, reactions were polarizing enough to press the issue into politicized channels. Foreign governments sent measured inquiries about precedent. A few asked for joint oversight, and 1 or 2 newspapers with teeth printed stories that accused Vought of attempting to privatize sovereignty. Activists organized small demonstrations calling for transparency and for protections that weren't authored by the companies that profit from them. The tenor of public sentiment shifted in small degrees, and then in one large one. The idea that a single corporation could have influence over national safety was no longer an abstract worry. It was a headline that could be cited in policy debates for months to come. The irreversible turn came when one of the legal drafts leaked to a site that specialized in whistleblower material, and in the leak there was a clause that mattered. Hard lock provisions allow for temporary privatized custody under emergency order. Once the clause was public, the argument changed from what can be done to what will be done, because leaking a plan makes the plan itself an actor. People began to understand how a quiet legal instrument could become an apparatus for detention without the protections that public institutions, at least in theory, must provide. By dusk, the containment machinery had achieved what it wanted on 2 fronts. It had prepared the legal and logistical scaffolding for action, and it had turned me into a dossier that governments, Vought, and covert teams could point to when they needed justification. My inbox filled with official notices, some veiled requests for meetings, others thinly coded threats. I read them as a map, each line an arrow toward a moment someone hoped to lock down forever. I was amused, because escalation likes to think it surprises, and surprised people are easier to own. But amusement has a shape. I could see the next move already materializing, a plane mobilizing in the night with a manifest no one would want signed publicly. The city woke to a network that had already decided I was the problem, and the first thing I noticed was how quickly routine law became architecture for containment. Vought International spun its public posture into a justification machine overnight, and their PR banners turned into curfew notices in municipal feeds before most people had finished their coffee. I sat with that fact like someone watching dominoes align, because when institutions calibrate to a single narrative, their next moves read like choreography, and you can predict where they will try to close the stage. This was a different escalation. It did not roar. It simply rearranged the city in ways that would make movement, speech, and sanctuary more expensive for anyone who didn't fit the new shape. By mid-morning, the mayor announced a temporary public safety directive that smelled like politics and smelled worse under pressure, and local stations read the language with the kind of solemnity reserved for funerals and fiscal reports. Transit routes were rerouted, bridges featured new checkpoints, and license plate scanners that had been dormant now hummed with attention, scooping metadata to build a map of who moved where. I watched feeds and old friends' posts and saw privacy dissolve into an audit log in less than a day, and somewhere between irritation and calculation, I realized the net being drawn wanted more than my capture. It wanted everyone to be watched so no one would ask how the net had been woven. The city had become the frame Vought hoped would make its ownership look like a public service. They called the plan hard lock in internal memos now more frequently than I heard it on stage, and the phrase carried the weight of a policy that had slid from corporate binder into municipal ordinance. That translation allowed private teams to act with public-sounding mandates, and with that veneer came contractors who moved like shadows in broad daylight. Men in dark vans with government placards, handheld scanners that flashed when they thought someone had the wrong face, and legal forms pushed at checkpoints that asked people to sign away ambiguity in a hurry. I walked past one of those vans and watched a driver slide a clipboard toward a trembling man who refused to give more than a name. The form asked for consent, and the man signed, because consent feels easier than conflict when the van has two cameras pointed at you. When the cameras point at someone, the cameras also teach people how to look, and the city taught its citizens to look like compliance. Yelp pages filled with reviews of safety teams, and neighborhood apps started private channels for residents to report anomalous activity, which translated into 1,000 tiny accusations that could be amplified by a single flagged note. Vought's message, safety in exchange for oversight, fell into that ecosystem like sugar into tea, dissolving quickly and making everything taste different. I walked the grid and listened to the murmurs, and the quiet truth was this. Once ordinary people begin treating each other as potential threats, the social fabric becomes something that can be cut and sold. Homelander watched the city with the expression of a man who loves an audience and despises surprise, and his reaction was exactly what the stage had prepared him for. He leaned into the optics with a smile that had been airbrushed for centuries. Homelander took the microphone at a broadcasted public reassurance event and spoke about order in a voice that sounded like salvation, and the cameras did the job they always do, turn performance into petition. He promised protection and demanded patience, and his words threaded through the city like a hymn that made people pause and tell themselves everything would be all right if they simply trusted one man to steer the ship. It is a terrible talent to make authority feel like comfort, and he has practiced that talent to the point of cruelty. Stan Edgar moved in a different register because executives think in contracts and leverage, and his reaction to the municipal adoption of hard lock was surgical and immediate. Stan Edgar called a half-dozen governors and a scattering of defense officials, offering support services and system integration in exchange for regulatory shelter and procurement contracts. He framed privatization as efficiency and packaged a security umbrella with a price list that states could not refuse without facing dissent in committee rooms. When corporate leaders propose to remove friction for governments, they are not being helpful. They are trying to become indispensable, and dependence is the first stage of ownership. The first checkpoints went up in neighborhoods that were already thin for resources, and the worst part about that was the predictability of consequences. People who could not prove residence were funneled to processing centers with forms that smelled like detention and time. Volunteers set up legal aid tents next to public school gyms that now functioned as intake centers for temporary evaluation. And the line of humanity that formed there looked less like protest than like a census operated by fear. I visited a tent and a woman told me, with a voice that refused to be anecdote, that her brother had been taken for questioning and not returned. The words were simple, but the implication was heavy, because once you give institutions the power to hold people quietly, they rarely explain their reasons. Satellite feeds and private drones started mapping the city in grid overlays and heat maps, and agencies coordinated via encrypted lines that did not respect borders between public and private. The military began to circulate non-binding advisories about unidentified power signatures, phrasing that lets planners keep options open without committing to action, and that ambiguity made the whole apparatus more dangerous. Contracts allowed Vought's teams to operate inside municipal perimeters with less oversight than typical police arrangements, and the result was that private security operated where public trust had previously stood. When oversight is outsourced to profit-seeking entities, the mechanisms of recourse decay, and the people who once relied on elected officials now found themselves negotiating with contractors. Civilians began to react in ways governments had long predicted and advertisers had long exploited. Some formed neighborhood watches bolstered by group chats that turned into vigil networks, while others fled to friends' apartments or left the city entirely, selling what they could and carrying the rest in boxes and backs. A small but determined resistance started on social media with hashtag mottos that tried to convert outrage into organized pressure. But the presence of physical checkpoints and legal threats made mobilization risky in a new way. The city fractured into microarenas of control, where one wrong post or one misinterpreted step could invite a visit from men with forms that looked official enough to scare people into silence. I began to map those microarenas as if I were reading a battlefield, because containment without combat has its own logic, and I prefer to know the geometry of the field I occupy. My presence made surveillance more aggressive and protocols more intrusive, and in response, a civilian network started leaving coded notes and safe routes that read like kindness in a system designed for suspicion. They were quiet gestures, bottles on stoops, marked mailboxes, a seemingly random chalk mark, but each one was a small refusal, and that collection of small refusals becomes significant over time. The public's private acts of resistance were not dramatic, but they were durable in a way that press releases are not. Press releases depend on attention, while people depend on each other. The irreversible escalation was not a single bullet or a single line in a memo. It was the point at which private security gained the legal apparatus to detain people under temporary custody clauses, and the first detentions occurred in a warehouse on the river where the lights were bright and the doors were heavy. Families called lawyers who discovered that warrants had been signed under emergency provisions that used corporate language as legal cover, and once a person disappears into a privatized custody loop, the public's ability to demand answers becomes a bureaucratic slog. That structural shift, turning a corporate desire to control into a legal instrument available at the municipal level, was now active, and removing it would require more than outrage. It would require structural change. As dusk folded into the city, the checkpoints hummed with a new urgency, and the mayor added a curfew that read, in softer language, like permission for private teams to enforce order after hours. People boarded windows, businesses closed early, and the skyline suddenly felt like something being watched instead of something lived under. I stood on a rooftop that overlooked a grid of lights and dark alleys, watched a pair of vans move like punctuation in the streets, and felt that particular kind of thrill that comes from watching a plan begin to unspool. The stage had changed into a cage, and the cage's hinges were now in motion. The only question left was who would hold the keys when the doors closed. The morning the military stopped pretending it was curiosity and started treating me like a problem set, the mood in the city tightened into a coil you could hear when a command was given. Orders went out in the kinds of phrases people use when they intend to make things disappear without a paper trail. Designated engagement protocols, deny staging areas, and the bureaucratic euphemism, neutralize threat vectors, and they arrived at night in encrypted packets that made lawyers sweat. I read the language the same way I read a bad joke. Someone had decided force was the answer to a question that had never asked for it, and that decision changes the shape of everyone's life in a hurry. The first visible step was not a missile, but a cordon of military vehicles that closed arterial roads, and you could feel the city compress, as if it understood it had been given new boundaries by men in uniforms who had decided they would rather command space than govern it. Vaught's salesmanship slid into the new architecture like a legal crowbar, and their offer to assist with federal assets turned ordinary logistical channels into contracts that smelled faintly of privatized immunity. Vought International briefed generals and committee chairs with the practiced calm of a vendor who knows his product will be bought when fear arrives on time. And inside those briefings Stan Edgar's presence was a quiet machine. Spreadsheets, risk matrices, and a line item that read like a demand dressed as aid. Military planners welcomed extra hands because procurement solves problems others will not spend political capital on. And once military logistics partner with corporate muscle, the distinction between public defense and private interest blurs. That blurring is how power consolidates quietly. The more hands in the operation, the fewer people left to ask why. On the second day, a drone formation was launched to map anomalous signatures above my last known coordinates, and watching those machines take their lines of flight felt like watching chess pieces move with lethal intent. Engineers monitored feeds, looking for odd telemetry, while men in suits annotated risk with a calm that could only be described as institutional habit. The swarm converged as ordered. Cameras fed the world a clinical image of defense in action, and the first drone to cross into my peripheral proximity stalled like a horse that had met an invisible gate. Its rotors sighed and then froze with a mechanical apology, and the engineers in the compound cursed into headsets, because the logs showed contact with a plane that did not exist in their maps. The failure was technical on paper and existential in practice, and roomfuls of people who depended on certainty felt their anchors loosen. That failure pushed the planners toward the decision they had been hemming around: manned response and kinetic options. They argued inside secure rooms in the kind of language that dresses fear in protocol. They drew diagrams of engagement zones and argued over permissible escalation ladders. And when one advisor suggested the use of a non-lethal electromagnetic pulse to disable local grids before an extraction, another advisor scribbled a contingency that read like a permission slip for darker methods. I listened to those transcripts when they leaked the way smoke leaks before a fire, and what I heard was the bureaucratic heartbeat of people more eager to close a file than to save a life. The move from drones to directed force is the moment a state chooses finality over negotiation. Homelander reacted the way the famous do when the law moves toward action. He positioned himself between the public and the military with the kind of spokesmanship only a cultivated celebrity can manage, offering to lead any operation that required strength and restraint. His offer arrived on broadcast like a pledge and in private messages like an ultimatum, and the optics were irresistible to decision-makers who wanted both a hero and deniability. He spoke about national duty and protection, while his handlers worked procurement channels with Vought, and together that triangle of star, company, and defense produced a momentum that had less to do with necessity than with the human need to see a visible hand on the wheel. He wanted the credit of action, governments wanted the narrative of control, and Vought wanted every possible contract that would tie a nation's security budget to its services. The first real confrontation came when planners cleared a surgical exclusion zone around a targeted training ground that would serve as bait, and they prepared to test non-kinetic containment devices they insisted would not harm people but would stabilize the environment. They evacuated a perimeter, called in media as controlled witnesses, and staged a precise line of escalation designed for maximum legibility. The world loves a demonstration because it lets people sleep for a night. I went because leaving would make them tell a story my absence would not complicate, and when the field technicians deployed their rig, the air thinned in a way that is only noticeable to people who listen to atmosphere as a radar. The rig pulsed, instruments read out anomalies, and small probes moved toward the zone where my presence had been measured days before. The probes met the same polite refusal the drones had. Their arms closed on nothing and the servos stuttered as if embarrassed. The technicians' faces tightened with the exact sort of fear that hides under operational competence. A colonel in charge of the field operation decided in that moment to escalate to live ordnance, arguing his decision like a man translating panic into orders. If containment won't hold, we remove the variable. They launched a directed kinetic charge designed to clear the airspace, and watching it arc toward the perimeter felt like watching a question being answered with the bluntness of a fist. The ordnance fell into the exclusion zone and detonated against emptiness where the probes had failed to contact me, and the blast sent a pressure wave that cracked the windows of a nearby observatory where journalists had been staged. People on camera screamed. Feeds cut to black and then came back with a different sort of image. A man standing in a circle of dust, untouched, who had walked into an unofficial combat zone because he could not let them mistake evacuation for victory. The image traveled faster than the official statements could be written, and the narrative turned from controlled test to a public demonstration of failure. The effect of that failed ordnance was immediate and irreversible in political terms. Lawmakers who had been sitting on the fence found their positions untenable when footage showed the state using force and failing, because failure demands answers that no spin can easily provide. Intelligence committees convened emergency briefings, and the language changed from deterrence to containment authorization, meaning the president and cabinet were now invited to bless measures with broad legal and moral implications. Vought's counsel argued for partnership agreements that would let the company assist in exchange for indemnity, and the question on every legislator's desk became not whether to act but who would control the action. Control is a currency, and everyone in the room had a ledger. For me, the military's misfires accomplished two things. They tested the limits of what their tools could touch, and they made the question of my fate a public and political one that could be used to justify extreme measures. The world had watched governments try and fail to make me legible to their instruments, and when institutions fail, the reflex is to close the loop with greater authority. That reflex moves faster than mercy and louder than law, and it pushes societies to trade liberty for the illusion of safety. In the hours after the field test, secure lines filled with notes about authorized lethal options and intervention windows, terms that sound sterile until you understand the human cost they sanitize. As dusk fell, the government's council requested a closed-door session, and the president signed a directive that, on its face, authorized a narrow operational window to engage, and if necessary, neutralize threats that could not be contained by lesser means. The wording left room for legal gymnastics and moral avoidance, but the meaning was plain. The state had moved from observation to a posture that accepted force as a near-term solution. Plans were drawn to coordinate a multinational task force with law enforcement, military assets, and contractors on retainer, and manifests were prepared in rooms where people who sign papers do not often see the consequences. In the quiet of that paperwork, a flight plan was filed, a team roster finalized, and men boarded toward a runway under cover of state necessity. The first visible step toward a move that would shatter more than optics when it landed. The world stopped pretending borders mattered the day the containment manifest left the tarmac, and I watched that manifest become a doctrine from a rooftop where the city still smelled faintly of coffee and fear. What began as a corporate PR problem had mutated into an international dilemma by breakfast. Statements traded in capitals, lawyers spoke in phrases designed to create loopholes, and ministers who had once argued about budgets were suddenly arguing about custody and jurisdiction. I read cables that moved like wolves through protocol, offers from private security that translated into requests from ministers, and offers from ministers that translated into legal cover for contractors. And the pattern was obvious because I know how systems fold when someone sells them certainty. The first real sign of global escalation wasn't a missile or a victory lap. It was a line of ink on paper where governments agreed to share authority with a corporation, turning a national problem into a transnational framework before the public could vote or even know the shape of what was happening. Within 48 hours, delegates took the emergency floor at United Nations, and the debate shifted from ethics to logistics like a magician changing sleight of hand while the room applauded. Representatives argued about precedents and humanitarian priorities while covert side conversations settled procurement and indemnity, and the language the chamber used: mutual assistance, shared custody, temporary custodial authority, was delicate enough to seem responsible and broad enough to be dangerous. I listened to translations and press leaks and realized this. When an international body frames a private solution as a public service, it converts corporate preference into global policy, and policy moves slow only until it needs to be enforced. The thing that frightened me wasn't that the world might try to control me. It was that the same machinery would be used to control far more than one anomalous man, and that once the machine existed, the definition of anomaly would expand by bureaucratic necessity. Vought International worked the room like a dealer with a trusted product, sliding proposals and white papers across tables with a smile that smelled faintly of contract law, and Stan Edgar's presence in a closed corridor felt like a metronome. Steady, inexorable, and absolutely uninterested in moral discomfort. Stan Edgar had spent decades learning to make language do heavy lifting for him, and his pitch was beautiful in a way only corporate ambition can be. Elegant charts that promised minimized risk to nations and maximized future revenue to his shareholders. When governments signed letters of intent to share operational control, they thought they were buying certainty. What they were buying was leverage that would be exercised in private and defended in public. That is the kind of trade that reshapes sovereignty without a single debate in an elected chamber, and it recontextualized everything I had been watching as a pre-planned climb toward a global program rather than a local containment effort. Reactions split like tectonic plates. Some nations demanded transparency and proposed binding treaty language limiting corporate custody and guaranteeing judicial oversight, while others signed procurement contracts the same day and cut warning cables to allies whose oversight questions were inconvenient. Intelligence services traded raw intercepts in secure forums, and a handful of powers quietly put their own people into the pipeline: experts, contractors, and ex-military cadres, because nobody wants to be left on the outside of a capability a corporation promises to offer. The moral calculus of these actors was simple. What can be useful can be controlled, and what can be controlled becomes an instrument of statecraft. I sat in briefings disguised as informal conversations, and I watched diplomats who once argued over tariffs now bargaining for first rights to temporary custody, windows with signatures that smelled of desperation. Homelander played his part on the global stage with the practiced generosity of men who have learned to read applause across languages. He stood on podiums abroad, promised protection, and offered himself as a visible arm of any nation that would invite him. That was always his bargain, visibility for legitimacy. And where Vought had ink and influence, he had the live wire of spectacle. The problem for him, and for every planner who still believed spectacle could substitute for effectiveness, was the physics of the thing. When governments tried to make me a target, their tools failed to reach where they intended. Drones jammed, sensors read phantom barriers where nothing existed, and the first attempt to take me in a coordinated international operation ended with a transport aircraft returning with a manifest that had fewer names on it than when it left. The public saw a plane take off and return, and they saw officials explain a technical anomaly, and the gap between image and truth grew wider. The revelation that recontextualized everything arrived not as a secret, but as a leak. Internal memos from several ministries suggested that Vought had already drafted bilateral agreements with more than a dozen states to provide stabilization services under emergency clauses, and the memos listed operational protocols that would allow citizen detention under private contracts. The leak made clear that hard lock was not merely a domestic posture but a playbook, templates for legal instruments that turned private security into semi-official custodians, complete with indemnity clauses and non-disclosure stipulations. That leak flipped the script for many watchers because it exposed intent rather than accident. What had looked like ad hoc escalation now revealed itself as strategy. People who had been watching for containment were suddenly watching for governance, and the conversation moved from "how do we stop this?" to "who will end up governing what we used to call public life?" Protests sprang up in capitals worldwide, not as mere spectacle but as urgent warnings. People who had not seen themselves as part of a narrative found their place in resistance. Streets that had been the stages of ordinary civic life filled with signs demanding transparency, and small coalitions formed between civil society groups and privacy advocates who had spent years preparing legal countermeasures that now had to be deployed. At the same time, governments that had opted into the Vought agreements began discrete operational drills that took place at night and in warehouses, where people with credentials and contracted badges practiced the mechanics of transfer, custody, and secure transport. The dual reality of public dissent and private preparation made the escalation feel inevitable because when institutions prepare, they create momentum. On an operational level, the world had already divided into two practical camps: those who wanted to regulate and limit, and those who wanted to operationalize and profit, and neither side had small incentives to slow down. The more nations signed, the faster the architecture consolidated. The faster the architecture consolidated, the fewer places remained where someone like me could move without detection. That was the practical consequence of the treaty drafts and procurement contracts. Mobility would become more expensive and sanctuary less available. For me, the meaning was clear. If I wanted to remain unconstrained, I had to compel a different kind of reaction than the one being mobilized against me. And that thought rearranged priorities into new geometries I had not been forced to consider before. By the time the first multinational task force took off on a coordinated flight plan, it was no longer a test. It was a commitment. Planes loaded with specialists, armored vehicles, and corporate tech left airfields under the legal cover the new agreements provided, and air corridors were temporarily cleared so that the operation would appear seamless on radar and narrative. That departure was the kind of irreversible motion that you can feel in your gut, the moment when a bureaucracy signs its own momentum into existence, and men in uniforms begin moving against people whose fate will likely never be fully visible to the public. I watched the flight take off from a different rooftop with a coffee that had gone cold, and I smiled because moments like that reveal a truth. Institutions move fastest when they believe they are correcting a problem, and people in motion make mistakes. The moment the task force left the runway, the battlefield moved into places that don't look like battlefields, and that change always favors the patient observer. I watched from a patch of rooftop that let me see the arteries of the city, lanes of light that now carried different intent, and I treated the day like a math problem with people instead of numbers. Public resistance had found form: neighborhood networks, encrypted drop points, volunteers who treated legal briefs like weapons, and 100 small acts that made the machinery of containment less smooth. At the same time, the other side was consolidating into muscle and memorandum, and when power builds a bureaucracy, it forgets what it's like to be surprised. Those are the best moments to be present. The first named reaction that mattered came from Homelander, who tried to translate spectacle into control and miscalculated how optics can be used against the spectacle itself. He kept insisting on public appearances because his strength lives off the crowd, and the more he tried to manufacture certainty, the more people began to see cracks instead of silhouettes. For a while his moves read like a trained script: appear, reassure, enforce. But people started to film the unscripted. The way his eyes scanned crowds for approval, the micro-PTS where his smile stalled, the moment his voice went too high when a mother asked for her son back. When a public figure depends on applause, the removal of applause is a form of violence, and that removal started to look like surrender on live feeds. Vought International doubled down on operational control with legal instruments that blurred the line between emergency measures and permanent tools, and in doing so, they created new villains faster than public outrage could name them. Their strategy was simple and ugly: make compliance easier than dissent by turning everyday conveniences into checkpoints, and sell the package as modernization. It works because people trade liberty for comfort in small pieces until they wake up in a cage built from convenience, and the first cage bars were now visible in municipal dashboards. Stan Edgar moved like a man who believed that writing rules is the same as owning people, and his spreadsheets smelled like certainty to people with budgets to protect. Stan Edgar reacted to resistance the way an executive reacts to a PR problem, by trying to instrument away complexity, and the result was a series of legal maneuvers that assumed compliance would be legislated faster than it could be contested. He pushed jurisdictions to sign interoperability agreements that made private contractors a lawful arm of public safety, and he offered indemnities in exchange for operational freedom. That is how privatization becomes permanent. When your legal counsel hands you a map of plausible deniability, and your partners accept it because their committees prefer calm to controversy. The irreversible cost of signing those maps is not visible in the conference rooms where men buy security. It is paid by people who vanish into custody systems where oversight is a rumor. Resistance answered by turning footage into court exhibits before lawyers could redact them, and that tactical pivot recontextualized the earlier leaks into legal momentum rather than gossip. Small groups built databases of footage and testimonies, labeled everything with timestamps and geotags, and started pushing them into journalists' hands and into subpoenable records. It was the sort of methodical dull work that makes bureaucracies tremble because it converts narrative into evidence. Suddenly, every failed drone, every drone that meant nothing, and every arm that reached through air and touched emptiness became an entry in a ledger that could not be spun away with a press release. That ledger changed the conversation from "can we control this?" to "what legal precedents are being set?" And that shift matters because law is a cage you can fight with facts. I chose my interventions in public like soft notes in a loud room because quiet dominion shatters pretense faster than fireworks. When a convoy of contractors moved down a residential street, vans with placards and a man with a clipboard, I walked beside them in plain clothes and let a technician attempt a scan. He reached the wand out professionally, and his device faltered in a way that looked random until the feed showed the readout. A system that expected a return signal and got nothing. The camera across the street caught the tech's confusion, the operator's fingers twitching over a tablet, and people who had gathered filmed the malfunction like it was a miracle. The technician's brow creased because he could not explain the data. I smiled because I could. That smile was not small or violent. It was the same expression I'd used on stage when a mic refused to touch me. It creates a tiny cognitive gap in observers. You expect a man in crisis to react, and when he doesn't, the room starts doing his job for him, inventing reasons for his stillness. My stillness let witnesses narrate their own experience without me interfering, and once they had their own narrative, the corporate script lost steam. Homelander tried to reclaim the frame by flying low and projecting the kind of benevolent menace his PR team had rehearsed. But when he hovered above a crowd, he intended to calm. People recorded, streamed, and compared that image to the footage of the night an ordnance cracked a press room ceiling. The comparison made his presence look less like protection and more like threat. At the same time, I allowed a subtle, controlled demonstration that didn't break any of the rules I'd set for myself. A squad approached a woman who had been detained via a temporary custody order, and an armored officer extended a taser in a show of procedure. The taser's arc shimmered and stopped a fraction of an inch from the officer's hand, as if the air itself refused the act. He jerked back, confused, and the bodycam footage that would later circulate showed the moment with brutal clarity. An instrument designed to take life paused because it encountered an impenetrable margin. The officers did not accuse me publicly because they did not want to be filmed practicing accusations on national television. Instead, they filed internal reports that read like equipment failure. That failure became evidence in waiting because people keep what they film. The revelation that recontextualized everything came from a place both small and brutal. A leaked contract appendix that mapped hard lock to a list of behaviors and defined anomaly in language so broad it could include journalists, activists, and entire communities. Once people saw the scope of the definition, vague, elastic, and tied to corporate custodial powers, the resistance found a legal lever. Lawyers and civil society groups sued to enjoin the clauses, citing overbreadth and danger to civil rights, and judges who had been watching footage with their children in the background began to ask hard questions in public. The legal challenges didn't stop contracts from being signed overnight, but they did create a path for undoing some of the architecture by forcing hearings and depositions that would reveal internal deliberations on the record. That process is slow, and slow is not always useful when vans are still taking people at night, but slow has leverage because it makes secrecy costly. Depositions begin to unspool conversations that executives had assumed would remain private, and once those private words enter public transcripts, they become tools for journalists and advocates. Stan Edgar's memos that once lived comfortably in locked drives began to face daylight, and that daylight changed the way investors and politicians looked at the venture. When people with power discover their correspondence can be subpoenaed, they act differently than they do when they believe their language is protected. Homelander's unraveling didn't happen in a single collapse. It was a series of small failures compounded by contradictory images and whispers. He tried to stage a rescue to reset his profile, and two things went wrong. The rescue was filmed by a bystander who had already seen the leaked contract, and that bystander asked why the man being rescued had been detained without charge. The question landed like a rock in a well, and the echo stayed. For a celebrity who trades legitimacy for applause, legitimacy is the one market you cannot force without the audience agreeing, and that agreement was crumbling. The irreversible escalation for me was not a battlefield decision. It was the point at which the machinery of privatized custody met sustained public documentation and legal challenge in ways that made secrecy a liability. Private teams could still detain people, but each detention now risked exposure, subpoena, and a public that had begun to collect and label evidence. That doesn't end oppression overnight, but it turns what was once a quiet mechanism of control into a contested theater where each act carries risk for the oppressor. I left the neighborhood that night with a new map in my head: routes, safe houses, legal contacts, and with the private knowledge that the next phase would demand different stakes from everyone involved. The counteroffensive did not begin with explosions or speeches. It began with coordination, and coordination is what institutions fear because it mirrors their own strengths. I watched encrypted channels stitch together a network of lawyers, journalists, civic technologists, and a handful of former insiders who had grown tired of signing documents that smelled like cages. What had been resistance in pockets became something structured: shared repositories of footage, synchronized filings in multiple jurisdictions, and timed releases designed to hit markets and news cycles at once. When you align evidence with timing, you turn outrage into leverage, and leverage is how you make bureaucracies hesitate. Vought International understood leverage, which is why their first reaction was to flood the zone with distractions. They rolled out a philanthropic initiative in 3 cities at once, announced a scholarship program, and sent spokespeople to morning shows to talk about community safety in tones that suggested paternal concern. It was classic narrative dilution: bury the specific under the general until the public forgets the thread. But the counteroffensive had learned from the early days of this conflict. They pinned every charitable announcement next to a leaked appendix from Hard Lock, and they asked a simple question: why does generosity require custody powers? Stan Edgar reacted to the synchronized legal strikes with the patience of a man who has survived boardroom coups, but patience is not immunity. Subpoenas landed on desks that had once been insulated by plausible deniability, and depositions were scheduled with names that mattered to procurement committees and campaign donors. He moved to seal records and argue national security exemptions, but the filings were too broad, the coordination too public. Investors began asking about exposure, not moral exposure, financial exposure. And when shareholders start calculating downside risk, executives start calculating concessions. At the same time, the streets refused to quiet down. Protests that had once been scattered now carried consistent messaging and legal observers in bright vests who documented every interaction. Civil rights attorneys positioned themselves at processing centers and demanded names, times, and charges. When they were denied, they filed emergency motions that forced judges to hold late-night hearings. The images of those hearings, judges rubbing their temples, city attorneys shuffling papers, became part of the narrative, and the narrative shifted from containment of anomaly to containment of rights. That shift is subtle but decisive because it reframes who the victim is. Homelander tried to reclaim momentum with a grand gesture, announcing a coordinated global assurance tour, meant to demonstrate unity between nations and Vought's capabilities. He flew into allied capitals, posed with leaders, and spoke about shared values in front of flags that fluttered on cue. But the counteroffensive anticipated spectacle and met it with documentation. In each city, activists projected excerpts from leaked agreements onto nearby buildings, highlighting indemnity clauses and custody provisions while he spoke about safety. The juxtaposition was brutal and elegant, his promise of protection framed against the fine print of power. I chose that moment to make a demonstration that was neither violent nor deniable. During one of the tour stops, as a multinational task force staged a controlled drill meant to showcase readiness, I walked into the perimeter with the same casual posture I had worn at the first press conference. Sensors registered my presence, and the drill's containment net, an array of coordinated emitters designed to simulate a capture, activated with a hum that rippled through the plaza. The hum reached me and stopped, like every other instrument that had tried to finish a thought where I stood. The emitters overloaded not with spectacle but with silence, their diagnostic screens flashing error codes that engineers could not parse because the failure was conceptual, not mechanical. The crowd saw a drill collapse under its own premise. They saw men in uniform look at devices that had been promised as solutions and find only blank returns. They saw Homelander hover in a posture meant to reassure and watched his eyes flick to handlers for cues that did not arrive. The humiliation was gradual, the way all meaningful humiliations are. Not a fall, but a realization spreading across faces that the narrative was wrong. Cameras caught the moment a senior official whispered to an aide and stepped off stage. And that step read like retreat to viewers who had been primed by weeks of documentation to question authority. The revelation that recontextualized the entire conflict arrived hours later when a coalition of attorneys filed a consolidated suit in federal court, challenging the constitutionality of the multinational custody framework. The filing cited not only domestic law but international human rights treaties, arguing that the delegation of detention authority to a private corporation violated core protections. They attached as exhibits the failed drill footage, the leaked appendices, and sworn affidavits from detainees who had been held without charge. For the first time, the conflict was not merely political or theatrical. It was judicial, and courts moved differently than cameras. Markets reacted before pundits did. Vought stock dipped as analysts downgraded projections based on legal uncertainty, and procurement committees paused pending contracts to avoid being entangled in potential injunctions. Stan Edgar faced questions not about ethics but about exposure, and exposure is a language executives respect. Governments that had signed letters of intent began inserting escape clauses, and a few quietly withdrew from pilot programs citing ongoing legal review. The architecture that had seemed inevitable a week ago now had visible cracks, and cracks invite inspection. None of this ended the detentions or dissolved the task forces overnight. Vans still moved in some cities, and some judges ruled narrowly in favor of emergency powers while appeals wound their way upward. But the counteroffensive had achieved something irreversible. It had turned secrecy into liability and spectacle into evidence. From that point forward, every action taken under hard lock would carry the risk of judicial scrutiny and market consequence. Institutions can withstand outrage. They struggle with sustained, coordinated accountability. As night fell after the failed drill, I stood at the edge of a river that reflected a skyline still unsure of its own story. I could feel the momentum shifting, not toward peace, not yet, but toward a confrontation that would no longer be limited to optics and ordinances. The legal fight would climb, and as it climbed, so would the stakes for those who had tied their reputations and budgets to a framework now under siege. The next phase would not be about whether I could be touched. It would be about what the world was willing to sacrifice to prove it could still define power on its own terms. The fracture did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived as a decision made in a quiet room where men and women convinced themselves they were preserving order. Courts had begun to question the custody framework. Markets were jittery, and the public was no longer content with curated reassurance. So someone at the highest tier chose escalation that would bypass paperwork and settle the question with spectacle. The directive was sealed under layers of classification, but I could feel it in the way airspace shifted and in the sudden alignment of military assets that had previously moved like separate thoughts. When institutions feel their authority slipping, they reach for demonstrations that cannot be ignored, and this one was designed to remind the world who writes the rules. Homelander was summoned not as a spokesman but as a spear, and the shift in his role was visible in the way his handlers stopped smiling and started issuing instructions. He was briefed on a multinational operation that would combine satellite targeting, directed energy platforms, and his own capacity for force, all framed as a last resort intervention authorized under emergency powers. The plan was elegant in its arrogance. Compress the sky around me with overlapping fields, strike with precision, and present the result as restoration of order. He agreed because agreement is how he proves relevance, and relevance is the oxygen he breathes. Vought International did not publicly own the plan, but their fingerprints were on the logistics. Contractors staffed control rooms, proprietary software integrated targeting data, and indemnity clauses were quietly activated to protect those who signed off. Stan Edgar did not need to appear on camera. His influence was in the alignment of incentives that made this operation seem inevitable to those who would carry it out. The corporate-state hybrid that had formed under hard lock now had its trial by fire, and everyone involved understood that success would cement the framework, while failure would fracture it beyond repair. The operation began at dusk when the sky over the city took on that metallic hue that makes people look up without knowing why. Satellites adjusted their orbits minutely, drones formed a lattice high above, and a perimeter of armored units sealed streets under the pretense of routine security. I felt the fields activate like pressure changes in a room, layered attempts to define space around me in mathematical terms. It was an impressive display of coordination. Nations, corporations, and a celebrity hero aligned for a single objective, and for a moment the city held its breath, as if waiting for gravity to choose a side. The first strike was not explosive. It was a convergence of directed energy meant to compress and immobilize. The beams met where I stood and found what every instrument had found before: a polite, absolute refusal. Infinity does not negotiate. It simply exists, and the energy bent and dispersed like rain meeting a dome. Control rooms erupted in shouted recalibrations, and Homelander descended through the lattice with the intention of finishing what machines could not. He moved fast enough to blur and struck with force calibrated to shatter concrete, but his fist met the same margin that had humbled drones and tasers. The impact did not reach me. It rebounded through him, and the cameras that had been cleared for controlled coverage captured the split second where confidence turned to disbelief. That was the moment the fracture became visible to the world. A man who had been framed as the ultimate instrument of order had swung with the backing of nations and touched nothing. The shockwave of his failed strike rippled outward, cracking windows and sending a tremor through the assembled units, and in the confusion, a secondary kinetic option was triggered prematurely. A missile, meant as contingency, streaked into the lattice and detonated against the invisible boundary that defined my space. The explosion tore a scar across the skyline, not because it touched me, but because it tore at everything around me that was not protected. Buildings lost facades, fires bloomed in pockets where glass had been turned to shrapnel, and sirens began to layer over one another in a chorus of consequence. The operation that had been designed as a precise restoration of order had become an uncontrolled disaster in seconds, and the world watched live feeds of smoke rising where a demonstration had been promised. Governments scrambled to cut transmission, Vought spokespeople fumbled for language, and Homelander hovered amid the debris with an expression that could not be packaged as reassurance. The fracture was no longer conceptual. It was architectural and human. I did not rage, and I did not retaliate with spectacle. I expanded my domain in a way that was precise and devastatingly quiet. Unlimited void is not a blast. It is a revelation, and I allowed it to brush only those who had chosen to orchestrate this convergence: the commanders in control rooms, the officers who had authorized the strike, and Homelander himself as he hung in the air searching for a narrative to grasp. For a fraction of a second stretched into infinity, they were flooded with information beyond their capacity to process, confronted with the full architecture of cause and effect they had set in motion. They saw the contracts, the clauses, the custody centers, the protests, the children separated from parents, the stock tickers, the closed-door briefings, all at once, without the buffer of rhetoric. When the domain receded, it left no crater, only men and women gasping in rooms lit by monitors, their certainty shattered. Homelander dropped a few feet before catching himself, eyes wide not with anger but with something closer to terror, because for the first time he had experienced a force that did not care about his image. Control rooms went silent as operators struggled to reconcile what they had perceived with what their instruments reported. The God-level confrontation had not been a clash of beams. It had been a collision between certainty and truth. The irreversible loss came not from my hand but from the miscalculated missile. Casualty reports began to scroll across emergency channels. Injuries, structural collapses, lives disrupted in seconds, and the public understood that the attempt to assert control had produced the very chaos it claimed to prevent. Markets halted trading, emergency sessions were called in legislatures worldwide, and the multinational custody framework faced not just legal challenge but political revolt. Heads of agencies resigned under pressure, and investigations were announced that would not be contained by press releases. As smoke drifted over the river and sirens continued their relentless rhythm, I stood at the center of a space no instrument could define, and understood that the world had crossed a threshold. This was no longer about a corporation seeking control or a hero defending his brand. It was about whether institutions would admit the limits of their power or double down, until the damage became irreversible in ways no court could repair. The fracture had exposed the fault lines beneath the stage, and those fault lines were widening. The cascade did not wait for apologies. It moved through institutions like a stress fracture through steel, invisible at first, and then undeniable when load was applied again. Emergency sessions in multiple capitals bled into one another across time zones, and every minister who had signed a custody agreement now faced questions that could not be answered with euphemism. The footage of the failed convergence and the smoke rising from the skyline looped in committee rooms where aides whispered about liability, impeachment, and treaty violations. When a state attempts a decisive show of force and instead produces chaos, it loses not only credibility but control over the tempo of events. Vought International moved into defensive lawyering with the reflex of a seasoned litigant, arguing that the multinational operation had been led by governments and that its role had been advisory. Press releases emphasized cooperation and compliance, while internal memos prioritized document retention and message discipline. Stan Edgar convened a board call that stretched past midnight, and investors who had once been reassured by indemnity clauses now demanded to know how those clauses would hold under international scrutiny. Exposure had shifted from theoretical to immediate, and when markets smell sustained uncertainty, they withdraw confidence like oxygen from a flame. Governments split into camps more openly now. Some announced independent investigations into the authorization chain that had greenlit the operation, suspending officials pending review and freezing further cooperation under hard lock frameworks. Others doubled down, invoking national security to shield documents and arguing that retreat would signal weakness to adversaries watching the spectacle. Intelligence agencies that had once shared notes began withholding, calculating that proximity to the operation could contaminate their own mandates. The multinational architecture that had seemed seamless a week earlier now showed seams everywhere, and each seam represented a jurisdictional fight that could take years to settle. Homelander became the focal point of a new kind of scrutiny. Commentators who had once praised his decisiveness replayed the moment his strike meant nothing, and asked what it meant for a hero to swing with the backing of nations and fail. He attempted to reclaim narrative control with a televised address, speaking about shared sacrifice and unforeseen variables, but the tone was off by a degree that audiences detect even when they cannot articulate why. The address felt less like reassurance and more like defense, and defense is a posture the powerful rarely inhabit gracefully. For a figure built on certainty, public doubt is corrosive. The irreversible cascade deepened when casualty numbers were confirmed and names were released. Families who had never cared about corporate custody clauses now cared very much about the missile that had torn through their lives, and their grief became testimony. Lawsuits multiplied across jurisdictions, not only against governments but against contractors and Vought subsidiaries named in operational documents. Class actions were filed alleging negligence, wrongful authorization, and civil rights violations, and courts that had once been cautious found themselves compelled by public record to act. Injunctions began to issue in narrow but significant ways, halting specific detention programs and freezing certain contracts pending review. I watched the legal landscape shift like tectonic plates, each motion small on its own and monumental in aggregate. Where once hard lock had been an expanding framework, it now faced constriction from multiple angles: judicial, political, financial. Depositions revealed email chains where executives had discussed optics before safety, and that revelation reframed the entire enterprise as profit-seeking under the guise of protection. Legislators who had been silent began drafting bills to curtail privatized custody powers, sensing the electorate's anger and the opportunity to distance themselves from a sinking ship. On the streets, resistance matured into oversight. Citizen groups organized independent review panels and demanded access to detention records, and in several cities, judges ordered the release of individuals held under emergency provisions without charge. Each release was a small crack in the wall that had been erected so quickly, and each crack widened public appetite for more. International human rights bodies announced inquiries into the operation's compliance with treaty obligations, and ambassadors who had once smiled beside Vought representatives now avoided cameras. For me, the cascade presented a choice: continue to demonstrate dominance through force, or allow the weight of institutional failure to bend the system under its own contradictions. I chose restraint again, not from mercy alone, but from calculation. Unlimited void had shown those at the center of power a glimpse of the consequences they had orchestrated, and that glimpse was already altering behavior in ways no further spectacle could improve. Power revealed is often more destabilizing than power unleashed, and I had no need to flatten cities to prove a point. The world was beginning to grasp on its own. Yet restraint did not mean disengagement. When a rogue faction within a defense ministry attempted a unilateral strike to salvage pride, I intercepted it before launch, not with destruction but with presence. The missile's guidance system froze as if confused, its targeting loop unable to resolve coordinates that defied its equations. Technicians stared at screens that insisted on a destination and received none, and the launch was scrubbed amid muttered accusations of sabotage. The message traveled quickly through back channels. Escalation would not restore control, it would only compound failure. The cascade's most profound effect was psychological. Leaders who had once believed they could define the boundaries of power now faced evidence that those boundaries were porous. Corporate executives who had treated sovereignty as a negotiable commodity now saw contracts morph into liabilities. Even Homelander, hovering in the aftermath of his address, began to understand that dominance cannot be asserted against a force that refuses the premise of competition. The world was not returning to normal. It was recalibrating around a new understanding of limits. By the time the sun rose on the third day after the failed operation, emergency powers in several nations had been scaled back or subjected to legislative review. Hard lock provisions were suspended in key jurisdictions pending inquiry, and multinational cooperation paused under the weight of legal uncertainty. The machinery of privatized custody did not vanish, but it no longer moved with unchecked momentum. In its place stood investigations, hearings, and a public that had tasted the cost of overreach and was not eager to swallow more. The irreversible nature of the cascade lay in trust. Trust in institutions had been shaken not by an external enemy but by the institution's own overreach, and rebuilding that trust would take years and perhaps a different architecture entirely. I stood once more on a rooftop, the skyline still scarred, and considered the final movement approaching. The world had been forced to confront the limits of force. Now it would have to decide what to build in the space those limits revealed. Authority rarely retreats quietly. It regroups, rebrands, and attempts one final consolidation that feels less like desperation and more like destiny. In the days after the cascade, as courts issued injunctions and markets wavered, a coalition of hardliners formed across borders with a single thesis. The previous failure had not been the result of overreach, but of insufficient resolve. They believed that hesitation had invited humiliation, and that a decisive, centralized command structure could restore order. I read their communications as they flowed through diplomatic cables and private channels, and I saw the pattern of men and women convincing themselves that escalation was clarity. This coalition did not move through corporate backrooms alone. It sought legitimacy through state apparatus, attempting to fold Vaught's operational capacity into a formalized international security mandate. Vought International was invited to testify before emergency councils not as a contractor, but as a strategic partner, and the language shifted subtly from indemnity to integration. Stan Edgar accepted the invitation with the composure of a man who understands that crises are opportunities when framed correctly, and he presented a proposal for a unified global stability authority that would centralize anomaly response under a single charter. The proposal was elegant, citing efficiency and shared burden, but beneath the polish lay a consolidation of power that would outlive any single emergency. Homelander was positioned as the visible guarantor of this new authority, a symbol meant to reassure populations that integration would not mean loss of protection. He stood beside diplomats and generals in a summit hall heavy with flags and microphones, speaking about lessons learned and the necessity of unity. His tone was measured, less triumphant than before, but still anchored in the belief that visible strength could anchor fragile institutions. The hall applauded because applause is easier than dissent in rooms where dissent is recorded and remembered. The last stand of authority was not a battlefield but a vote. Emergency delegates convened to consider the charter that would formalize the Global Stability Authority, granting it cross-border operational rights, and a mandate to coordinate responses to entities deemed beyond conventional containment. Civil society groups protested outside, waving documents and citing constitutional clauses, while inside, representatives weighed sovereignty against the promise of streamlined control. I watched the proceedings from a vantage point both literal and strategic, aware that the outcome would shape not only my circumstances, but the architecture of power for generations. Debates stretched into the night, and amendments were proposed that would introduce oversight committees and sunset clauses. Hardliners resisted, arguing that constraints would recreate the fragmentation that had led to failure. Moderates pushed for judicial review mechanisms and transparency requirements, aware that without them the charter would collapse under public scrutiny. The tension in the hall was palpable, a collective recognition that they were about to codify either a safeguard or a precedent for centralized force beyond easy recall. As the vote approached, a faction within the coalition attempted to bypass deliberation entirely. In a secure chamber adjacent to the summit, they prepared an executive directive that would activate the authority provisionally, arguing that immediate action was necessary to prevent further instability. The directive required only a handful of signatures from leaders already aligned with the hardline position, and once enacted, it would create facts on the ground that later votes could only ratify or resist at greater cost. It was a maneuver born of impatience and fear, and it threatened to render the public debate ornamental. I stepped into that secure chamber not with force but with presence, and the act of crossing that threshold altered the calculus more effectively than any explosion could have. Officials froze mid-discussion, as if a variable they had abstracted into policy had become inconveniently real. The draft directive lay on a polished table, its clauses promising swift authority and coordinated might. I regarded it as one might regard a contract for one's own confinement, and I allowed a fraction of unlimited void to bloom, not enough to shatter minds, but enough to dissolve the illusion that signatures exist in isolation from consequence. For a suspended instant, the architects of the directive experienced the cascade they were about to accelerate. Protests swelling into unrest, international courts convening emergency sessions, markets plummeting under sanctions, and their own names etched into histories not as saviors, but as cautionary examples. They saw the Global Stability Authority morph from protective shell to instrument of repression, and they felt the weight of the precedents they would set. When the vision receded, the pen in one leader's hand hovered above the page, trembling not from fear of me, but from recognition of the path ahead. News of the chamber interruption reached the summit floor before the vote could be called, and the atmosphere shifted from procedural to existential. Delegates who had been prepared to approve the charter, as amended, now faced evidence that its provisional activation had nearly occurred without their consent. The revelation reframed the entire debate, casting the proposal not as a measured response, but as a vehicle for concentrated authority vulnerable to abuse. Moderates found new courage, citing the attempted bypass as proof that stronger safeguards were necessary, or that the charter should be rejected outright. Stan Edgar recalibrated quickly, sensing that overt consolidation would now trigger backlash. He publicly endorsed the inclusion of strict oversight and sunset provisions, positioning himself as responsive rather than domineering. It was a tactical retreat designed to preserve influence within constraints rather than lose everything in a failed power grab. Homelander, observing the shift, adjusted his rhetoric to emphasize accountability alongside strength, an unfamiliar pairing that betrayed how far the ground had moved beneath him. The vote, when it finally occurred, rejected the provisional activation and mandated a revised charter subject to judicial review in multiple jurisdictions before any operational authority could take effect. It was not a dismantling of ambition, but it was a decisive break on unchecked consolidation. The last stand of authority had faltered not because force had been overwhelmed, but because exposure had rendered secrecy untenable. The coalition fractured along ideological lines, and the hardliners retreated into committees where their influence would be contested rather than assumed. The irreversible outcome was not the abolition of coordinated response, but the embedding of oversight into its DNA. Any future authority would be born under scrutiny, its mandates narrower and its powers contested in court before deployment. Institutions had been forced to internalize the limits they had tried to override, and that internalization would shape policy long after headlines faded. I left the summit hall as dawn painted the sky in neutral tones, aware that the final movement would not be about defeating authority, but about defining the new equilibrium that would replace its overreach. The world did not wake to celebration. It woke to negotiation. In the weeks after the summit, committees worked through drafts that read less like declarations of dominance and more like uneasy truces between fear and freedom. The revised charter for coordinated anomaly response was narrowed, layered with judicial triggers and automatic expirations, and stripped of the privatized custody powers that had fueled the original escalation. Nations that had rushed to sign hard lock agreements now moved cautiously, inserting domestic review requirements and public reporting mandates. The irreversible shift was subtle but profound. Authority would no longer be able to hide behind urgency without facing immediate, structured scrutiny. Vought International did not collapse, but it contracted. Procurement pipelines slowed, contracts were renegotiated, and oversight boards were established with access to internal communications that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Stan Edgar remained at the helm, but his leverage had changed. He now operated within a lattice of compliance requirements that limited unilateral maneuvering. Investors demanded transparency clauses and risk disclosures specific to anomaly engagements, and the market punished ambiguity. The company that had once sought to write global policy now found itself adapting to it. Homelander faced a different recalibration. His public addresses shifted from declarations of control to acknowledgments of limits, a rhetorical evolution that would have seemed impossible before the fracture. He still flew, still intervened where cameras gathered, but the aura of unquestioned dominance had thinned. Panels debated his role not as a savior, but as a participant in a system newly aware of its own fragility. He learned in his way that power untempered by accountability invites resistance that no spectacle can silence. Detention centers established under emergency provisions were reviewed case by case. Judges ordered releases, oversight committees demanded records, and families reunited under circumstances that would be remembered long after policy memos were archived. Civil society groups that had formed in crisis did not dissolve. They institutionalized, creating watchdog organizations with mandates to monitor any future activation of coordinated response mechanisms. The architecture of resistance became part of the architecture of governance, and that integration ensured that no single entity could again move so quickly without being seen. Internationally, the failed convergence became a case study in overreach. Military academies analyzed the operation not only for tactical missteps, but for the strategic error of assuming that force could resolve a legitimacy crisis. Diplomatic corps incorporated lessons about transparency and multilateral restraint into training modules. Even intelligence agencies revised engagement protocols to include legal and public perception risk assessments before operational planning. The cascade had embedded caution into systems that had once prized decisiveness above all. For me, the decisive outcome was not a victory parade or a vanquished adversary. It was the normalization of limits. Infinity had never been about domination. It had been about the simple fact that some boundaries cannot be crossed by will alone. By forcing institutions to confront that reality without annihilating them, I had altered their trajectory. They would still err, still overreach in moments of panic, but they would do so in a world where precedent constrained ambition and where the public had tasted both danger and agency. The skyline that had once been scarred by miscalculated force bore the marks of reconstruction, and those marks became reminders rather than propaganda. Memorials were erected not to celebrate containment, but to acknowledge the cost of hubris. Public forums debated the ethics of power in ways that transcended my presence, and younger lawmakers cited the crisis as the moment they understood the necessity of checks that cannot be waived by executive whim. The conversation about anomalies expanded to include broader questions about civil liberties, corporate influence, and the speed at which emergency powers can calcify into permanence. There were losses that could not be undone. Families who had lost loved ones to the cascade carried grief that no charter could erase, and communities displaced by the initial lockdowns bore scars of distrust. The world did not return to a pre-crisis innocence, because innocence had been revealed as a fiction sustained by complacency. Instead, it settled into a more complicated equilibrium where vigilance was shared rather than outsourced. That is the kind of permanence that follows true fracture, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of memory in every decision. I continued to move through that world with the same relaxed posture I had worn when I first walked into a press conference built for propaganda. My presence no longer triggered immediate lockdowns or multinational task forces. It triggered committees and conversations, which are slower and far less dramatic. That shift might seem anticlimactic to those who prefer spectacle, but it is decisive in a way explosions never are. Authority had been forced to accept that it could not hard lock reality into submission without consequences that would outpace its control. The title of the program that had started this chain, Hard Lock, remained in archives and think pieces as shorthand for a period when institutions tried to freeze uncertainty and instead cracked their own foundations. Scholars would dissect it, policymakers would cite it, and executives would remember it when tempted to blur lines between public mandate and private gain. The world without a lock was not safer in the naive sense. It was safer because its guardians had been reminded that power must be exercised within boundaries that cannot be negotiated away. As dusk settled on a city that had learned the cost of overreach, I stood once more above its lights and considered the simple truth that had unraveled a global apparatus. Some forces cannot be owned, branded, or contained by decree. The decisive outcome was not my dominance over institutions, but their acceptance that dominance has limits. That acceptance permanently altered the world's architecture of power, embedding caution where arrogance had once thrived. And in that altered architecture, the stage built for propaganda could no longer be mistaken for reality.